And now, police motorcyclists coming through. Crowd are just catching a sight of this figure now. Yes, he's alongside Winnie Mandela, both of them raising their arms in the air. Many in the crowd can see them. A big roar of ANC goes up from the crowd. Everybody's now rushing up to the prison gate. And now Mr. Mandela walks through the gate. He's a free man as of this moment. He's waving his fist repeatedly in the air. He's smiling. He's a very alert, very imposing looking figure, slightly greying hair, upright, a beaming Winnie Mandela alongside him. The crowd are responding with their fists raised in the air too. And somebody's taking a big ANC flag fluttering in the stiff breeze through the prison gate, and another one goes in there. ANC flags are actually being taken inside the prison entrance. It is a quite remarkable moment. Now the police motorcycles setting off, and the convoy follows. And as Mr. Mandela's vehicle passes out of the gate once again, the great roar ANC goes up once more. And so this man on whom such high hopes are placed by very many people in South Africa is now a free man. It's very possible that the course of South African politics will take a different turn from this moment.
Good afternoon, Ria. Welcome to my virtual Jericho on the 17th of November. We are massively privileged this afternoon to have one of the legends of broadcasting, one of the legends of the BBC, Mike Wooldridge, who was the African correspondent. You heard him there reporting on Mandela. He's reported from Africa, from Asia, from all over the world. He's a fellow Oxford resident now, so he's sort of retired to Oxford. Mike, years and years and years, you witnessed history. Was that the most momentous moment you remember?
It certainly seems that way to me. I mean, there have been others, obviously involving much greater numbers of people from other parts of the world, but as a moment of broadcasting and of personal experience, certainly for me, that counts as the biggest.
What did releasing Mandela mean for South Africa?
It was an absolute turning point, of course. Let me just, in fact, tell you a little bit about the circumstances around that to indicate perhaps just how much of one it was. And I think that I was well aware while I was standing outside the gates of that prison, Victor Verster prison, watching him come out, that every other journalist in Africa, probably everyone in the world, would like to have been there as well. So it was certainly a privilege to do that. It nearly didn't happen, that broadcast, in the way that you heard it. It was announced just the evening before by the government that he exactly which day and when he would be released, the following afternoon in Cape Town. And I was up in Johannesburg at that point, broadcasting on the announcement, and actually managed to miss the last flight down to Cape Town. And a number of other journalists have had the same experience. And so we all, in fact, had a charter flight, a small plane down to take us all down in time, first thing the next morning. Drove along to the prison, which was about 40 kilometers or so outside Cape Town near Paarl. I'd been there before, but it was only when I was approaching the gates of the prison that it dawned on me that there was no house anywhere close to the gates of the prison. This was a very rural area where I would be able to see him come out and actually report live. And obviously that was the one thing I had to be able to do that day, to report live, not just for Britain, but for around the world on the World Service. And what I think was interesting is where we come to a turning point for Africa. I was standing there looking at the gates, considering my plight and the potential loss of my career, I think all in one thought. And when a telephone van, a van from the South African telephone service came by, and an Afrikaner, as it happened, and I later learned, called Andre Puchert, leant out of it, and he said, "You look as if you've got a problem. Can I help?" And so seeing what the van was, I said, you certainly can. And it ended up with me signing a contract with him for the grand sum of 240 rand, as it was at that time, a contract for him to clamber up the telegraph pole opposite the gates and attach a line to it. In fact, again, I only learned later, cutting off the line, the telephone line further on down, but bringing a line down to it, sticking an instrument on the end, which meant that I could stand on top of a car and broadcast the whole event live. So that it was thanks to Andre Pourkert that it happened. What you actually saw there, by the way, was the live radio commentary that I did of the release. And in fact, because the release was all delayed, we had the line open for about 2 hours, the build up to it and the aftermath as well. The pictures we added on at the time that Nelson Mandela died back in 2013 to be able to use then and recall that moment. After that, I had to speed to Cape Town, as indeed Nelson Mandela did, to hear him in really what was another just as momentous event as his coming out of the gates, of course, was his first words to the world and to South Africa. And the first time, of course, so many people had seen him, all the people who'd been standing around the gates, except for the older ones who might have seen him before he went into prison 27 years before. No pictures of him had been taken or circulated while he was in prison. Everybody was seeing him face to face for the first time. And in his speech, he made clear, perhaps almost most interestingly, that he was not going to retract support for the armed struggle as an instrument in the ANC's campaign to bring about real political change in South Africa. It's pretty clear that the government hoped, obviously an unlikely hope, but hoped that he might be willing to do that, but he didn't. He wanted to keep the pressure up. So certainly at that time, he didn't want to be seen to be withdrawing the potential continuing use of armed tactics. So it was just an extraordinary day all round. Obviously, those scenes, the crowds, you heard me among them outside the gates, their reactions, and also the very large crowds outside Cape Town Town Hall that evening. The excitement of both places palpable, but outside the town hall, darkness had fallen, the tension too, particularly around the edges of the crowd, and the police were certainly nervous. And so, in a way, both those events captured just how much of an event, of course, it was for South Africa, for the whole world, and not least because this was the first time people were able to assess him as a person, because so many myths had been created around him. He had, for example, been known as the Black Pimpernel when he was on the run in South Africa before his moving from house to house and evading the police. And then came the very high-profile Rivonia trial. Of course, his marriage to Winnie Mandela, the pressure she'd come under from the authorities, all this added to the image and in some ways the myth around him. And although there were plenty of other icons of the anti-apartheid movement and activism, Steve Biko, Walter Sisulu, Albertina Sisulu, and Governor Mbeki and Desmond Tutu, was certainly Mandela, who had the biggest global reputation, and things like those concerts in London and elsewhere around the world calling for his release. I think what was really interesting, given all the expectations, the high expectations that there were around this, was when on leaving Cape Town, he went back home to Soweto, just outside Johannesburg, where he had lived when he was a lawyer and indeed, of course, an activist, and where he launched the armed struggle at that time. And so many young people now had turned out to see him in Soweto, to see him in the flesh, and this figure they'd heard so much about, and many of them had been taking part in school boycotts in protest against black education, and indeed had been subjected to a lot of attacks and trouble for doing that. Now, they were certainly surprised. So I was standing there alongside quite a lot of them, of youngsters, watching Mandela as he spoke outside his old house. They were very surprised in many cases to find Mandela thanking them for coming, but then promptly telling them they should go back to school because it was important for them, and giving them quite a lecture on education, like some headmaster. So that again was a very interesting development, and I think it went on to demonstrate how right from the start he really wanted to kind of start in a way to impose some sort of discipline, difficult as it was at that time, and to make sure that there would, he hoped, be negotiations that would lead to genuine political change in which everybody would share. I covered the start of those negotiations with the government, the violence that tragically continued, exiles starting to return. And there really were very difficult times in those years that then led on to the historic 1994 election, and particularly when the very popular figure Chris Hani was killed, was assassinated by a white extremist on the East Rand. This was in 1993. And with that event, in many ways, I mean, he'd been virtually as popular as Mandela had. Again, particularly with younger people, there were fears that the conflict could have exploded horrendously. There was plenty of violence going on at this time. And that day, Nelson Mandela spoke a few hours after he'd been killed, calling for calm and no retaliation. But he made no bones about the fact that the country was, he said, teetering on the brink of disaster as a result of this action. It was a watershed. And he said to those listening to him, we must not let the men who worship war plunge our country into another Angola. Of course, that was a country nearby that was in a lot of trouble at that time, and the country was on a knife edge. And in fact, many people would say that it was that speech, that action that he took, which in fact kept things reasonably on track. Then the negotiations remained very difficult right up to the elections themselves. And just in contrast to this, giving a portrait, if you like, of Mandela the man, I remember talking to Cheryl Karola. She was another major anti-apartheid leader who was very much involved, member of the ANC, very much involved in the negotiating with the government at that time. And she told me that, and the negotiations were gone for many hours each day, she had a message telling her that her father was very ill. They were in Cape Town. She had a message telling her that her father was very ill in hospital. And she read that and she felt like our negotiations are so important, and I really do not feel I can go to see him. But it so happened, and I think they were having a short break, and Mandela learned independently of this that her father was very ill, and he came straight across to tell her, I know that you haven't, I know you've heard about this, you haven't responded, and I suspect that's for me and for the sake of the negotiations, you must go and see him now. And she found that a very touching story, which tells you something about, well, a lot, I think, about his personality, the different aspects of his personality. And then, of course, the 94 elections, I was back in South Africa for all those amazing scenes of all the people, the black voters voting, of course, for the first time, who queued for many hours. I was down in Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape. I remember one woman telling me that the day had been like the parting of the Red Sea for her people. And it certainly felt like that as you looked at people waiting with such great patience. And then he becomes, of course, as a result of all this, South Africa's first black president. And I think what's really interesting there in terms of the impact that all of this was to have on South Africa was that obviously he had many calls on him to travel the world. And South Africa so much had been an international pariah. But here was the world wanting to see him, just like the people of South Africa. He traveled frequently. He clearly felt this was a very important role for him at this time to have South Africa welcomed back with open arms, to bring in more investment and so on. He also played a big part in the rest of Africa at this time. South Africa had been very much isolated and cut off from much of sub-Saharan Africa all those years. So you saw South Africa playing its part in peacekeeping and so on. The contrast to this in South Africa itself, and again, I think this tells us much about him. He had, of course, to deal with all the expectations of the poor for practical change in their lives. Now, their hero had been released in terms of housing, jobs and security, all much tougher. And I think people feel that, I've heard it said, people feel that Mandela remained above these grievances about progress. And it wasn't long before some ANC leaders and others, not so much Mandela himself, and officials were seen as benefiting from a gravy train at this time. Desmond Tutu was stepping up his criticisms on those lines. Differences were emerging between activists who'd gone into exile and those who'd stayed in South Africa. And perhaps it's only emerged when Mandela stood down. Of course, he only stood one term as president. Thabo Mbeki succeeded him. And then an arms scandal erupted on a really big scale, you might remember. And it turned out that had actually begun in Nelson Mandela's time. And people started saying that perhaps he had delegated too much. He trusted in colleagues he shouldn't have trusted so much. And then, of course, Thabo Mbeki then is succeeded by Jacob Zuma. Charges of corruption against the ANC, against Zuma himself in particular, grew, and increasing public dissatisfaction with the government. And really, some of that still remains in effect, even though we have a new president now, Cyril Ramaphosa, but he's having to deal with the effects of all that, and of course, really challenging times.
Interrupt for a second, Mike. That's the Mandela, the man and the myth. Is it all true?
I think it'll be very interesting. I think we're starting to hear, I haven't been for a couple of years, but even then, people were saying that there will be, in time, kind of new stories, new assessments of Mandela coming out. And indeed, I've read, probably you have, that almost since then, in this last couple of years, there are more younger people who've seen their own hopes and expectations dashed, who found it so difficult to get jobs and so on. Some would look back on it and see that he'd made too many concessions to the whites, and there's more sort of open criticism of him for that. I would only set against that. I was back for his death in 2013, for that long period, those months when he was ill. Remember all the people coming up to the outside of the hospital. There was that wall of tributes and so on. And then the funeral itself. And interviewing a lot of young people at that time who would also say they did, beginning to say some of those things, and certainly felt how hard a much greater struggle it still was for them than they had thought it might be. But also said they would recognize that he, above all, Nelson Mandela, had made possible such changes as had occurred since, and gave them at least new hope in so many ways. So they would still want to hold him very much the figure who, although of course in prison for 27 years, what he had inspired from his own activism and the way people then were able to champion him around the world, that was what had levered the change that had taken place since.
30 years after his release, would he recognise South Africa today?
Would he recognise
Mandela recognise South Africa today?
I think there's absolutely no doubt he'd be very disappointed in the inequality that still exists. I mean, he was very, very strong on, of course, trying to give the highest priority to poverty of his own government and other governments around the world in their own work and investment and so on in South Africa. He'd be very disappointed, I think, at all the growing difficulties of unemployment in many ways. And I think he would be tackling it very forcefully and head on. He'd be very disappointed, I'm sure, about the corruption that's taken place, particularly under Jacob Zuma's time. No, I think there's no doubt about that.
So moving on from Mandela to the rest of Africa, the dark continent and all the rest of it. It's you've reported all over. You've reported from some rather troublesome spots. Perhaps you'd like to tell us about South Sudan.
Yes, I will. Let me just say, you pick up, of course, that famous old phrase, which causes great grief in Africa, the dark continent. And I know you didn't mean it in that way, but I must say, from in traveling to Africa before I was a BBC correspondent there and working there as a VSO volunteer, but then in the years that I was correspondent in East Africa and then Southern Africa, what's immediately struck me was we need to see South Africa essentially as 55 separate countries, defying generalizations about the whole continent, though there are some common factors among those for sure, following the patterns of former colonial rule or geography or climate, for example. And indeed, there were the countries that saw reasonable stability and hope after independence from the colonial power, only, as we know, to go on and experience military coups, rather a number of them, with damaging results very often, and periods of political instability, though not in every case. Overlaying all this, of course, was the impact of the Cold War on Africa, with some parts of the continent a proxy for the Cold War, and particularly the Horn of Africa. And that then brought with it political ideologies that would further destabilize countries and impact heavily on business and economic development and investment. And this, and where we move towards Sudan and South Sudan specifically with this, this all followed that general shift away, happily, from military interventions and governments to a growth of democratic governments, but in a number of cases, persistent problems, corruption. And we shouldn't forget that a number of African countries have seen some of the fastest economic growth rates in the world in recent years. But just as we were saying in South Africa, for the very poor, job opportunities remain so elusive, and poor families very vulnerable to shocks from illness and loss of jobs and disasters. But I think in the context of all that, there was perhaps never more hope for a better future than among the people of South Sudan as it became independent from Sudan in 2011. And just to paint the picture, mostly Christian or animist in South Sudan, they were parting from their Arab and predominantly Muslim northern neighbors after some 40 years of on-off civil war since Sudan's independence in the mid-1950s. And so we have South Sudan then as an independent country and still the world's newest nation, enjoying a great deal of international goodwill, really, as it became independent, but tragically plunging into violence after only 2 years when the vice president, Riek Machar, rebelled against the president, Salva Kiir. So you then have a politically driven new conflicts, but playing on ethnic rivalries. I'd been there quite a few times when I was based in Africa as East Africa correspondent, and I was keen to see the impact now that independence had finally come, but as I say, hopes had been so dashed. So I went back there in 2014 to do some further reporting to see why this was happening. Like many of us, I guess I like to go to places that people generally don't go to or can't get to. And while we were there, cameraman Simon Smith and I seized the opportunity to join a church party on an old bus and enter the small region of Abyei, which had been contested between northerners and southerners for years, and essentially had been left out of this independence agreement because that dispute remained unresolved. So there it was, right up on the border, in a still disputed part of the border between North and South. So for the curiosity value, if nothing else, let's see this report from remote Abyei, straddling Sudan and South Sudan, and still vulnerable to lawlessness and worse.
Abyei is a place largely frozen in its own story of conflict. This church, roofless and gutted, is one of many buildings in the region's main town that have been destroyed or severely damaged in attacks from the Muslim-dominated north in 2008 and 2011.
We know that we are fighting, we know that politically we are not agreeing, but we don't see a reason why the church is involved. The church is just for God, it's for God people, for faithful people. Why should they destroy the church?
Ethiopian UN peacekeepers on patrol around the town's mosque, unscarred by the violence of recent years, but the scene of a confrontation last week between local Dinka youths and members of the northern and Arab Missouriya tribe. It ended with one person dead. On the walls of this battle-damaged school, a slogan scrawled in Arabic. This is so you remember who did this. For these children from families that have fled Abyei town, temporary schooling in this village at a safer distance.
The future of Abyei is here and in many other schools for displaced children, but politically it remains a very uncertain future. A new attempts now being made to resolve once and for all the claims made by both Sudan and South Sudan on this long disputed region. Until that happens, many thousands of people in Abyei will still have no place they can call home.
Now, Mike, you obviously fell in love with Africa as a young teenager when you went there on VSO. Tell us a little bit about that before we get on to Suzanne.
Yes, I most certainly did. That was in Uganda, and I think that the huge value of being. I went as a journalist. I was a newspaper journalist in East Anglia at that time, so it certainly opened my eyes to a wider world to go to Africa, to go to Uganda. But I was working with the cooperatives, and what was doing really sort of information work of various kinds with them. And I think what that did was to really teach me something about the people's vulnerability, for sure, and really, of course, how you can get left behind from various forms of development, and but also what people do for themselves in cooperating together to make things better. It worked at that time. The cooperatives were really successful there in East Africa, but it certainly gave me at least an introduction to the whole business of development and vulnerability and so on. That was to come in particularly useful for me when later, as East Africa correspondent, I was to cover, which we were talking about, the release of Nelson Mandela being my biggest story, but the other one that at the very end of the spectrum, a totally different kind of story, was covering the Ethiopian famine of 1984. I find it particularly sad, and I'm sure others who are following the news closely at the moment, that conflict and displacement, which we see so often in Africa, have done, is what's happening right now again in the northern part of Ethiopia, building up over this past 3 weeks into something that could be very serious indeed, and this after a period of strong growth. And it's in the very place that in 1984, where we covered the huge Ethiopian famine of that time. In fact, I mean, it burst very belatedly into the world's consciousness. I and others had been covering its build-up, but it certainly hadn't been getting the attention around the world that it had deserved. But it was at a particular time in October '84 when our team of 4 people, that's Michael Burke, my television colleague at that time, legendary cameraman Mohammed Amin, his sound recordist, and me as the East Africa correspondent of the BBC reporting for radio, we finally succeeded in extracting from the authorities then, the military government, the necessary permission to get to this very restricted region in the northern highlands, where many thousands we discovered, certainly seeing it then for the first time ourselves, had already died and were dying. And our reports of the terrible scenes we saw both at Coram and Mekelle very much in the news again now, went viral in today's language, and dramatic on-the-ground reporting from others followed. And of course, the international aid operation, which at that time was on an unprecedented scale, but famine of those sort of proportions couldn't be turned around quickly. And well into 1985, there were places where the death toll remained horrific. I mean, I was in that area in effect for 2 to 3 months. And I remember going to report on the recovery operations in one camp, Bati, in 1985, where there were still then 134 deaths in a single day as measles swept through a camp there and took the lives of already weakened children. So the Ethiopian famine obviously is a huge benchmark of my own reporting life. One thing.
Sorry to interrupt. You and Michael Burke actually changed history there, did you not?
Well, along with many other people, but we were certainly at the place at the time able to bring out, as I say, having got, after a long time of trying permission to get to that particular area, the epicenter of the famine. This was the key thing. That was the time at which people were able, I think, first able to appreciate the full scale of that famine.
Were you surprised at the reaction to Burke's piece and your piece? Were you surprised at how the public was shocked by it?
No, I wasn't surprised, and you know, because we were certainly shocked on the ground, as of course. And I suppose, I mean, as a journalist, the real challenge then was just to try to convey that. But it was the strength of it when you. But you know, we succeeded in doing so. Particularly, I have to say, Michael's extraordinary, very historic commentary going with Mohammed Amin's equally historic pictures. That, of course, the impact of that television around the world was so huge. As a legacy of that, I've been back to Ethiopia quite a lot since. It made me realize, a very kind of place that made me realize how important it is to go back if you can. You can't always do that in journalism. It can be difficult for all sorts of reasons. You're caught up in other things, competing demands, or getting the money to do so. Ethiopia is a place I've quite often been able to go back to see how things have moved on. Sometimes they have under different governments and at different times. Other times they've seen great setbacks. And a decade ago, one particular occasion, there was another famine in the Horn of Africa. It leaked over into Ethiopia, but its again, epicenter was really in Ethiopia's neighbor, Somalia. Somalia was embroiled at that time in the conflict between its very beleaguered central government and the Islamist movement Al-Shabaab. Many people were trying to flee the fighting and the famine conditions and cross into a corner of Ethiopia. And we managed to get there on the back of an emergency visit by the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, and stay on to do a week of reporting on the plight of those displaced by the famine. And it was later estimated that in that famine, 250,000 people had died in the region before aid operations had scaled up to an adequate level. Now, okay, the 1984-85 famine, it was estimated that 1 million people had died, and many of those before we were able really to bring that the absolute scale of horror to the world. Here, this is years on, again, 250,000. Terrific that you can get a repetition of a situation like that. Well, 3 months later, after seeing that, I was able to go back again to the Ethiopia-Somalia border town of Dolo Ado, and I wrote this piece, broadcast this piece for Radio Force from our own correspondent.
Dolo Ado was different. July's pervasive, hot, searing winds and the swirling dust that penetrated everything seemed to have gone now, but only to be replaced by a different set of challenges for refugees and aid workers alike. The wait for the UN flight from Addis Ababa took 5 days. The small dirt airstrip was waterlogged. Seasonal rains have set in, and they're a mixed blessing. Dry riverbeds quickly turn into torrents. The gravel road leading from Dolo Ado to the refugee camps can easily be cut. The camps themselves become muddy and sodden, tense, damaged. The whole footprint of the aid operation is bigger now. There's a completely new camp since I was last there. Another community of 25,000 refugees on what was just a bare, arid site in July. In this camp, there are tents as far as the eye can see. There's a busy marketplace. Trenches are being dug to pipe in water. I visit the clinic, where the rains have brought a rise in diarrheal diseases and respiratory infections, and an aid worker tells me that antibiotics are flying off the shelves. Lying on one bed in the intensive care tent is 18-month-old Ismail Ibrahim, weighing just 5 kilos, sick as well as malnourished and fighting for his life. A 5th camp is about to be established, and that's because the refugees are still coming. I talked to a group who've just walked into Ethiopia along the sandy track that crosses the border. The story remains the same. They've been driven here by the fighting in Somalia as well as the famine, the last of their animals now dead. Dealing with this continuing influx of Somalis is still a highly precarious business. In the refugee transit centre on the edge of Dolo Ado, there's a striking barometer of the pressure on the entire aid operation. This time they're feeding a hot meal of goat meat and rice to 5,800 people in the middle of the day, and doing it all over again in the evening, all cooked from scratch in large vats over an open fire. Back in July, I was there on a day when they somehow fed nearly 8,000 people, twice. Travel around the region, and there are reminders everywhere of the complexity of this emergency, of the impact of conflict and politics, of the apparently increasing unpredictability of the climate, and of the extra pressure on people resulting from high prices and underlying poverty. For many, a long recovery lies ahead. The drought in Ethiopia itself has not turned into famine. The Ethiopian government says this shows the effectiveness of its donor-supported schemes for protecting those most vulnerable to hunger. But it's clear they are being severely tested. One scene seemed to show the determination of people to get through the emergency. Several hundred kilometres to the northeast, across Ethiopia's Somali region from Doloado and its refugees, we came across Basra Yusuf Abdi, preparing for her son's wedding. As for so many families in the region, their livelihood is entirely dependent on their animals. They move at times like this, looking for grazing and water, guarding their precious livestock against the threat from wild animals. If our animals die, Basra said, we may also be eaten by the hyenas. But all around there was ululating and laughter as they got ready for the wedding. It will be a lot of work, Basra told me, but I want to make a nice wedding for him.
Mike, reporting on all of this misery, does it ever test your faith? Do you ever feel, gosh, why did God make this happen?
No, I don't. I mean, I know a lot of people ask that question, of course. I mean, I think probably because I see faith in a rather different way, and indeed have been religious affairs correspondent during my career. So it is certainly true. I think probably clergy, for example, get themselves into greatest difficulties when they try to answer that question as to why God causes such suffering, because in a way it is a totally unanswerable question. But no, it certainly, I mean, it does become dispiriting, but we all know that in countries even that go through the worst, there are happily also plenty of other stories of a different kind. That's been true of those we've already talked about so far.
Now, on all of these stories, you're a firefighter, really. You were going in to fight the fire and report it. The style of foreign reporting has changed in the BBC quite a lot. Maybe more local correspondence. How do you feel about that?
Yes, it has. But in fact, I mean, we should absolutely recognise that there have always been lots of local correspondents, often working alongside you when you, as you put it, go into firefight, and they've been incredibly dependent on them. I'm very glad to say that is more recognised now. They're more used on screen and on the air. So I think that's been the knowledge is obviously so much greater. There are some times when it can indeed be useful to have an outside perspective, but I think that is indeed a very welcome development, really. And certainly I look back on huge pleasure with working with all manner of colleagues. That was particularly so actually when I was South Asia correspondent after from the mid-1990s through to the beginning of the 2000s, where there is an extremely strong core of local correspondence, utterly essential, and of course the BBC using them for all of its services to the region as well. So yes, I certainly am somebody who very much gets the benefits of that.
So are the days of gung-ho foreign correspondence gone now, do you think?
I suspect they're not totally gone, but I think that it takes all sorts to make a world of correspondence. But what I do think now is we are getting, in a way, a more comprehensive coverage of many parts of the world. However, for all sorts of reasons, they can be budgetary as much. And partly that is because of changes in technology that allow us to report, particularly live from across the world, so much more easily than we ever could, the miniaturization of equipment and so on. So I think we are getting more comprehensive coverage of many places. It would also be true to say, though, that there's still many parts of the map where we don't get enough regular coverage, I would say. I mean, I think I'd probably cite Afghanistan among that. And when I was South Asia correspondent, and then after that, when I was a World Affairs correspondent, have been on a number of deployments to Afghanistan. And I did want to just show you, if I may, something from one of those. This was rather different. This wasn't at the time when I went there. I was there as a news correspondent at the time, but additionally to that, I got an opportunity to do something else, which I hope demonstrate other aspects of life that we should always be striving to bring out, I think. This was immediately after the Taliban fell after they were removed, of course, by the American-led bombing campaign at the end of 2001 after the 9/11 attacks. I had been up in the northeast of Afghanistan covering that. But then when the Taliban left Kabul, I came down to Kabul, and I'd been asked to, along with a producer called Simon Broughton, I had been asked to look at, we had told the BBC about the phenomenon of music suddenly returning to Kabul and other parts of Afghanistan in the most extraordinary way. The Taliban, of course, have been very opposed to music. There'd been a strong music culture in Afghanistan, but they were very opposed to it. Many musicians, if they were able to, had buried their instruments away. Others were destroyed. Musicians had been killed. And so we made a film about it for the newly launched BBC 4 at that time called Breaking the Silence. And here's part of it.
وقتی که ما روز دوم سوم آمدن طالبان که در کابل آمده بودن، ما در رادیو آمدیم در 32:48 وقتی که دیدیم که این طالبا این نمی ساز تنبوره با زمین زدن و با پای خود و با چیز خود ایره شکستاندن که مثل زی سازای دیگر هم کلش زدن با زمین و او را در دادن.
Musicians waiting backstage at the Kabul Theatre. The audience is about to witness the first music performance here in a decade. Amidst the rubble, it's a symbolic event of rebirth out of the ruins. Music in Afghanistan is a powerful voice, and for that reason it's been targeted in years of fighting. When the Taliban took over Kabul 5 years ago, they banned all music, theatre and TV. Since they fell last November, Afghans are eagerly rediscovering their music after the long silence.
Did that give you a lot of hope to see that at the end of a long, cold winter of the Taliban, Mike?
It most certainly did, and it particularly because Kabul, in particular, that musicians' quarter of Kabul had been destroyed almost totally this was more in the interfighting between different branches of the Mujahideen than under the Taliban, but it was looking such a desperate city, that part of the city where music had been so much a part of life, that to have the prospect now of it returning. I was told along the way there that almost the only music that had kept going during the time of the Taliban was in fact at weddings, when women would play on tambourines, and because the Taliban wouldn't be able to go into those quarters, they either never heard it or just happened to have let that pass, I think. So I did think that was quite a nice little insight as well. But certainly I think there was a big element of hope in that.
What does the reign of the Taliban tell you about religious zealotry and indeed ISIS as well? You know, where does it cross the line?
What it tells me, I think, is that kind of extremism, obviously, it is a tragic hijacking of religion, if you like, for purposes of that kind, for political extremism and for violence, but also in a way for any form of discrimination and intolerance in religion. I mean, that's obviously what gives rise to the so often said there's bad religion and good religion. There's an awful lot of bad religion around, and that is certainly a strong example of it. And I was, in fact, following something the other day. A point was made that we might associate that sort of extremism, particularly in Islam, with the most conservative and orthodox forms of the faith. But it isn't the case. Many of the more conservative movements wouldn't actually dream of engaging in violence. It's very often people who have been more engaged in crime and so on. And if you like, they are misusing the faith to try and get some support for their actions. And so I do think those are interesting reflections on it. I must say, being religious affairs correspondent, I mentioned earlier that I did that, I think I said for 6 years, from 1990 to the end of 1996. And for myself, I felt there was a strong sense of continuity in that, from having lived and worked in Africa for a total of 10 years, and then going on to be a correspondent in South Asia. In both those parts of the world, religion is often so much more of a visible force and glue in society, if you like. And I tried to make that job as global as I could and as travel budgets would allow. But there was at that time a busy domestic agenda as well, with the Church of England, for example, voting to ordain women to the priesthood, the first ordination, same-sex relationships, an increasing issue for churches, clerical sex abuse starting to emerge, and the impact of communal violence in India on relations between South Asian French communities here, anti-Semitism, all of those things. But that was an extraordinarily rewarding job. It took me to the Falklands, to Sweden, to America, to Armenia, to Kenya, to Canberra, and many places in between, reporting on faiths. You asked me earlier about the impact of things I'd seen on my faith, and I wasn't surprised you asked me that. And I have in mind here the cautioning words of Nelson Mandela that I noticed the other day. His quotes, of course, are one of his great legacies. He said, "Always make religion a personal and private affair confined to yourself. Don't burden others with your religious and other personal affairs." And another time he said, "It's always best to treat the relationship between a man and his God as a purely personal affair, a question of faith and not logic. No one has the right to prescribe to others what they should or should not believe in." So that's what the Methodist Nelson Mandela said of it all. But I don't think this affected the way I covered religion as a religious affairs correspondent. And I think, in fact, you could be a religious affairs correspondent without having any particular faith of your own, but it, I hope, helps in the understanding of it. And my own upbringing in life have been shaped by the Christian narrative and tradition, and the fact that it is still so relevant today in so many people's lives. But I have very much been influenced as well by the phenomenon and experience of faiths and beliefs of many other kinds. And as I see it at this stage of my life, the heart of the most of the world's religions, Christianity included, holds much more mystery than certainty, and that mystery allows faith to evolve as we come to new understandings about ways of living and human relationships. So as I say, if you do happen to see faith in that way, what is a problem is the hijacking of faith for other reasons.
Oh, might you have been better journalistically if you were an atheist as a religious correspondent? The BBC at one point had an atheist as head of religious affairs, and indeed has had two Muslims as head of religion. Were those wise moves?
No, I said just a moment ago, I think it's perfectly possible to do it as an atheist, and you could argue that gives a detachment and a distance. But also, again, I think maybe it can help with in your understanding and for your coverage if you have at least a degree of personal faith yourself. It's a bit like I'm not sure about the argument of detachment at all. I mean, we were talking earlier about a greater use of local correspondence, and thank goodness we're seeing that. And of course, the only issue there is you would certainly, in actually covering stories of any kind, you of course then would, and this is a thing you called this, you gave me the title for this talk of Troubles with the Conscience. Well, the conscience, I think, as a journalist for any of us, and all of us would hold to this, is to be impartial and to be fair. So whatever personal engagement or commitment you might have with a place or an issue. So no, I think whether you do it as a journalist, whether you do it as an atheist, or a person of faith yourself, I think that shouldn't have a particular effect on the way the stories come out.
You're still making religious programs, aren't you, for the World Service? Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Yes, I am. They are programs rather than news coverage, obviously. I have left the staff now, but even when I was a news correspondent, I was very lucky to have the opportunity to make programs, longer programs for radio mostly, both in fact with two Oxfordshire-based producers. One, Ruth Evans, very illustrious producer, has made many programs, won awards and so on. So to be able to make programs with her when I was on the staff was a great joy. And I've gone on to make several programs with her since leaving the staff. One of those, the most recent one I made with her was in fact in India, where of course I was as correspondent, news correspondent earlier on. And we covered the extraordinarily interesting story of the Baghdadi Jews, as they're known, the Jews originally from Iraq and indeed from Syria, who migrated to India and their fate in India. Absolutely fascinating program to make. And indeed, as I say, I've made that program with her. That's for the BBC World Service series, Heart and Soul, and I've made other programs for Heart and Soul as well, not with Ruth, but also these have been very much on, it's a mini series within it called The Right Thing, about people who have acute dilemmas which lead to extremely painful, difficult decisions for them and the consequences of those decisions. I'm just in the throes of making 3 more programs now, and the most recent I made of those were on the protest leader at the beginning of the protest movement in Hong Kong, Joshua Wong, and also on a Senegalese father who had conjoined twins and had to face acutely difficult ethical decisions about the possibility of, or otherwise, of surgery to separate them. So it's been brilliant to be able to make those programs.
You spent your entire professional life, or virtually, from the lowest off times working for the BBC. How long have you worked? Are you up to 50 years yet? From first time?
45 years on the staff of the BBC, as you say, lowest off journal.
There is a feeling the BBC is in a little bit of peril at the moment, more than a little bit of peril. How do you feel about that?
There most certainly is, and I think that's very sad. I mean, I don't think that it could, you say in peril, I don't think it's in fundamental peril. And I think in a way, quite a lot of this, we spoke about impartiality just a moment ago, and I hold very much to the view that impartiality continues to be an extremely important thing for BBC to be able to treasure and to demonstrate all the time in terms of fairness. But also, I think a lot of the other issues that are being faced and talked about very much at the moment are really what are facing the wider media, particularly the public interest media or public broadcast media. And obviously, they're from the digital revolution. That's in many ways right that it should have to do so, and it will absolutely. It's perhaps caught up belatedly in some areas of its own digital output. That's imposing new budgetary constraints to be able to do that properly, alongside what is best of all the other things that it has always done, which may indeed require new ways of making all of that happen together. But I would very much hope that the BBC can, as it has been in the past so much, continue to be a leader in harnessing all these new developments and making the most of them for the benefit of the widest number of people, and not for the furtherance, particularly thinking of digital revolution around the world and the BBC's output around the world, not for the furtherance of any kind of digital divide, but to make sure that absolutely everybody can benefit from it. And also in terms of social media, not to make sure that that is used in the wrong way, but the right way. And I think that I was listening to or watching the award ceremony for the
Wheeler on Monday, for the Wheeler, yeah?
Wheeler Awards, that's right. And Peter Bazalgette at that, obviously chairman of the ITV. We have perhaps an increasing amount of now is narrowcasting, social media, obviously by definition, in many ways doing that, and other new forms as against the broadcasting, genuine broadcasting that the BBC and other public broadcasters have upheld, and how important it is to be able to not only maintain but strengthen in any ways possible that broadcasting, and I absolutely go along with that.
Now, if Tim Davie were to ring you up and say, Mike, how shall I sell the BBC to the public? What does it mean to be a BBC correspondent outside of Britain?
And I very much hope that that is exactly, it is the output of the great army of correspondents outside and inside Britain that I think remains, in many ways always has been, and remains one of the greatest strengths. I'm not sure the public need a great convincing of that, but I think it remains the greatest argument for the distinction of the BBC and other public broadcasters. BBC has the resources to do much of this in a bigger way than others can, but I do think that is and then there's another, if I can just say alongside that, it's not just the news coverage by the Corps of Foreign Correspondents, which I'm hugely pleased to have been able to play a small part in over the years. But I'm now, and have been since I left the staff, so for the last 5 years, a trustee of the BBC's own international development charity, BBC Media Action, which not a lot of people even know about here. But that does, I believe, a very, very important job in helping to strengthen public interest media around the world and to work with them, in particular to do more programming, better programming in areas of health and resilience and governance and development generally, but in particular to help enrich and strengthen genuine broadcasting around the world, working in 24 countries. So he may well wish to draw on that, even though it doesn't directly use money from the BBC. Nevertheless, very much tries to represent and make sure that in its own activities and its activities with journalists around the world, it represents the values of the BBC. So that can be another standard bearer for the organisation.
We're running out of time, but what do those three letters when you land in a foreign country? You say, I'm from the BBC. What does that mean to the people you come across?
Well, I have to just say, first immediate thought is sometimes it helps. It gets you into the country and it gets you access to all sorts of people. It can certainly do that, and not just officials, ministers and so on, politicians you might need to, public figures you might need to broadcast, but ordinary folk who hear it on the world service, for example. It carries a great sort of cachet with it, that is true. In some cases, it gets you thrown out. I've had experience of that myself. I've been, tragically, the only country I've actually been deported from was Uganda, the place where I first came to have my first experience in Africa and got so much insight from it. But it all got settled in 2 years and I got back in. So it can work against you and also frighten some people off being interviewed.
A couple of quick questions from the audience. Torrin Douglas, who you know, says, are you going to enter your programs for the Sanford St. Martin Awards this year?
It's not up to me where that happens, but I hope where that's a program that would be fit for entering, we do that. That's a very kind question from Torrin.
And a question from Ivor Gaber, Professor Gaber. What's the West legacy in Africa? Is colonialism left anything good? Can we build back better?
Well, I absolutely think, I mean, one of the things when you've been a colonial power, I think, is that you can take years to, and in some ways, I guess Britain has, you can take years to work out a new relationship with the country or the continent where you've been in that colonialism. You can be embarrassed about it or feel shackled by it. I would like to think that Britain's been agile enough to shift that relationship into totally new way, where it is hoping to, well, build back better after times of disaster. And I've covered a lot of disasters and humanitarian crises and seen British-based aid agencies, example, and British aid money, if you like, playing their part in building back better, but also just in general development, not only after disasters, playing its part. It would have been tragic, I think, if Britain and France in their colonialism and so on had gone into any kind of retreat. You have a totally new politics in these countries, and sometimes that's going to make it difficult to do things. But every reason to increase involvement in practical ways and do the kind of things that I'm glad to say charities like BBC Media Action do, and so many others.
Last question from me. What's your relationship to Oxford, and how do you feel about living here?
It's fantastic to live here. It really has been here 7 years now. In practical terms, hugely enjoy places like in our bit of Oxford, live in Headington. So in places like Shotover and the Warnford Meadow, very, very close by. I have just to say that other things that I greatly valued, the organisation Ox Peace, which I'm sure will mean much to many of those who are participating in this. The prime mover in that, the Reverend Liz Carmichael of St John's College, a fantastic organisation working towards peace building, extremely interesting events that they hold, and I found them extremely interesting to go to. So a little plug for Ox Peace, which I hadn't known about before I came here. And the other thing is that the absolutely fascinating for me to discover just how much access the public seem to have, at least in normal times, now it would only be online, to talks, to lectures, to and even often to seminars given at colleges. Now, I've been to a lot of those. I wish I'd had time to go to a lot more, but everyone I've been to, I think, with the exception, has been hugely interesting. I've learned a lot. One in particular, I remember, I think it was in the Faculty of Law at St Cross. I think it was there on Guantanamo, absolutely riveting. And I suppose in a way for me, I'm almost getting to attend, in that way at least, the university that I never went to. I didn't go to university myself.
I was going to ask you about, at the age of 16 or 18, you became an apprentice in the Lowestoft Times.
Yeah, Lowestoft Journal, right? Yeah.
Lowestoft Journal. Would you still become a journalist now?
Absolutely. No change whatsoever. The wish to do so actually began a little earlier than that. Began at the age of 9 in my primary school, when my teacher, Hannah Stanton, made me editor of the class newspaper. Fantastic. Nothing else I wanted. Mind you, didn't make it any easier to get a job in the first instance, going out in ever widening circles from Dorset, where I was at the time. And it was in Lowestoft where I eventually managed to get a job. So it was 30 attempts or whatever. So even then, it's even harder today, I know, but eventually I got it. I'm so pleased.
Thank you very much. It's been absolutely fascinating. Now, next week we were due to have the editor of the Oxford Times, who's only just taken office about 2 weeks ago. But he tells me he doesn't know enough about Oxford yet, so he's going to come later in the series. But tomorrow night, a special, the British High Commission to Guyana. I was born in Guyana to declare an interest. Who's just come in the end of 5 years. Is an interesting man. He's a Northern Irish prod, and he actually saved democracy in Guyana because there was an election which people were trying to fiddle, and he stopped it. Him and the American ambassador and the Canadian ambassador stopped it happening. So there's it isn't often the British save democracy. There he is saving democracy. But do tune in for that tomorrow night at 19:15 on YouTube. And meanwhile, Mike, thank you very, very much indeed, and see you again soon.
Thank you very much, Nick, for asking me. Thank you. Thanks, John.